I've challenged Midjourney and Stable Diffusion with the same prompts, and we're going to look at them side by side. We'll go through a number of rounds covering everything from portraits to landscapes. So let's jump in. Number 1 is a dream of a distant galaxy, and we can see that Midjourney has a greater narrative to the piece. They've included a character looking distantly into this space odyssey, whereas Stable Diffusion has outputted something that's a little bit more garish and less coherent. Next up, we have an elegant fantasy couple kissing, and again, the consistency in the facial features and in the bodies, the anatomy is much greater inside of Midjourney. I can even say that Midjourney has accurately inputted 5 fingers to a hand, or maybe this is 7. But the hands are still improving. These are very coherent and easily identifiable faces. Next up, we have a tired woman wearing a Valentino gown sitting in a roadside diner. And although the hands of Midjourney are still very tiny and look more like a walnut than a pair of hands, the overall composition and feeling of the piece is much more engaging than Stable Diffusion, which has outputted something very much more abstract, and this woman looks more like she has a trotter than a hand. Next up, we have a fantasy cyberpunk princess. You can see Stable Diffusion's version is all the more together, less detailed, less intricate. The composition and its anatomy is failing in comparison to Midjourney. We have this girl with absolutely remarkable abs and a wonderful symmetry to the background that's leading our gaze in. You can see these leading lines bringing us into the center of the piece, whereas the lines inside of Stable Diffusion sort of lead us out of the piece. And altogether, for me, there's something slightly more immature about the output from Stable Diffusion. So many people have been commenting that the removal of nudity and celebrities from Stable Diffusion has had an impact on the anatomy inside of the works. So let's just try a celebrity to illustrate this point. This is young Timothée Chalamet, and you can see that the Midjourney outputting gives a greater likeness to the man himself. But what's interesting is that Midjourney is using a data set that is a few years old, and this is reflected in the age that we're seeing Timothée at. It's also interesting that there is still a passing likeness to Timothée Chalamet in Stable Diffusion, despite celebrities being removed from the data set. So if there's still some sort of residue left in the data set for Stable Diffusion to still be able to identify and create a likeness. But if we just look at the age of Timothée now, looking much more adult than he does here, there's still this boyishness. Next up, we have an example stock photo of a lion, and Stable Diffusion, I would say, is performing. This is the closest run we've had between the images. I think if you didn't know that this was a piece of AI art and you were just glancing at it, there's no reason to think that this might not even be a real photo. So going into more detail, again, the stock photo area is one where Stable Diffusion is catching up to Midjourney. But there's something for me overall that Stable Diffusion seems to have less underlying taste. And although the latest data set that they're using is supposed to be on as an aesthetic subset of the image database, the way that it creates images are generally, for me, much more rudimentary, immature, and lacking in an aesthetic eye. It kind of spits out a lot of the generic images you imagine to see on stock sites, like terrible stock photos. Yeah, when you get some very cheesy, generic style images that are often very overexposed and highly saturated with unrealistic posed frame situations, something almost wooden and alien-like to them. Framing the texture, the approach from Midjourney is all the more aesthetic and pleasing. There's something I would comment on is that Midjourney often has a tendency to create things with a slightly melancholic feel to them. It often errs on the side of melancholy. On the deepest level, I believe we are most attracted to not the things that bring us the most joy, but the things that allow us to see the darkness in ourselves. And the depth of Midjourney is picking up on this. We don't want all rainbows and butterflies. Sometimes we want to explore our shadows. And there's a reflection at the deepest level with Midjourney identifying this inside of our culture. Finally, we have a landscape composition. This is an Icelandic beach, and although Stable Diffusion performs much better at landscapes, still lifes, and stock photos, it's not quite at the same level as Midjourney. For me personally, my view is that although Stable Diffusion is taking steps forwards, it's also taking steps backwards, with anatomy and consistency stepping down, whilst landscapes and still life are stepping up. I personally will continue to use Midjourney for my work. Let me know what you think in the comments. Which is your favorite? And what are you looking forward to most in the future? I'm Samson Vols. This is Delightful Design. Have a delightful day.